and now they're Christians. We have a new seed, a spiritual seed, an incorruptible seed, and we've got to have a corresponding lifestyle. We are new creations. We are already suited for an eternal existence. We are already righteous and holy in terms of that new nature, and we might as well throw off that old smelly lifestyle. And yet, isn't it tragic that instead of the church conforming the world to the principles of Christ, the world winds up shoving us into its own mold? The word Gentiles, look at it for a moment in verse 17, ethne. We get the word ethnic from it. It is a word that means nations, peoples, heathen, pagans, sometimes translated, or Gentiles. It is simply an ethnic term. And it is used in the New Testament when it is used in terms of races to speak of non-Jews. And that is its nationalistic meaning. But further than that, it has a religious meaning. And if you want to know what the religious meaning is, you need only to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 5. Because it says there this, 1 Thessalonians 4:5. Not in the lust of evil desire as the ethne who know not God. On the one hand, then, ethne, or Gentile, refers to an ethnic group of non-Jews racially. On the other hand, religiously, it speaks of people who know not whom? God. God, who know not God. So, the point is, you do not walk, and walk, by the way, speaks of daily manner of life. You do not live your daily manner of life like people who don't know God. It's that simple. You know God. The believers in the ancient world found that difficult. The pagan life all around them and the deeds of the pagans were constantly in front of them, and it was very difficult to live a different life, just as it is today. We have a terrible problem in our own age. The church in America, the church around the world today, but particularly in America because of its affluence and because of its media inundation of evil, constantly has a difficult time affecting the world. You know, our problem isn't getting the world to live like Christians. Our problem is getting Christians to stop living like the world. That's the real issue. Very difficult because of the tremendous impact of our society. Let me just tell you about Ephesus a little bit, and you can draw some parallels to our own day. Ephesus was one of the most dissolute and evil of all the cities. In fact, some felt it was the evil city of all in Asia Minor. It was really a religious center. There were multiple temples and idols and all of that kind of thing. But it was particularly focused on the temple of Diana. Diana, and another name for Diana is Artemis. And by the way, if you're thinking of some beautiful looking thing, of course, we've told you before, Artemis was a big, black, ugly thing that looked like something between a cow and a wolf. Horrible looking thing. It supposedly fell out of heaven, so they worshiped this big black thing. But the temple of Diana was the seventh wonder of the world. It was an art museum with few equals. They had their collections of great works of art. It was an asylum for criminals. 1/4 mile around the circumference of the temple of Diana was King's X for any criminal. So you can imagine the crowd they collected there. It was the greatest bank in the world. A sacred temple like this was a good place for a bank because in those days security was very difficult to come by. The locks were very primitive, etc., etc. And the best place to put a bank was in the middle of a temple because people would be fearful to get in there and do anything because of the reprisal of the gods which they lived in fear of. So they made temples into banks. So it was a place where there was a lot of money. It was a business also. Pilgrims by the thousands came to this place. And the worship that went on there was orgiastic, and so it was very popular. All you have to do is invent a religion where sex is the key thing, and you'll have a whole bunch of people signing up right on the dotted line to get involved, and that's exactly what they did. It was a big business, and of course they sold these little idols. You remember about the revolt of the silversmiths, the terrible riots that broke out when they ruined the business there. The apostles came in and shut down all the business. People couldn't sell their little gods, and had a problem. They used to take their gods and they used to place them in their homes, these little things. And they also, interestingly enough, I read they hung them around their necks, religious jewelry, around their wrists, around their ankles, and they put them on the front of their chariot. I don't know if they had a dashboard on their chariot, but that's the idea. So it was a big business. The goddess of Ephesus, Diana, was worshipped as a sex goddess. The place was packed with eunuchs who were made eunuchs in order to accommodate that kind of activity. There were thousands of priestesses and temple prostitutes, singers, dancers, and a whole great big orgy occurred. One writer says the worship was a kind of hysteria where the people with shouts and music worked themselves into frenzies of shameless sexual activity, including mutilation, self-mutilation. Heraclitus said the temple was, quote, the darkness of vileness, the morals were lower than animals, and the inhabitants of Ephesus were fit only to be drowned, end quote. Some kind of place. The little church in Ephesus was an island in a cesspool. It was a vile, sinful world for those early Christians to live in, and so the Apostle Paul says to them right off the bat in verse 17, you got to be different. Got to be different. Can't walk like they walk. Can't do what they do. Living the new life is tough, but living the new life is necessary. Got to put off that old man, that old lifestyle. By the way, they took good people and fed them to hungry animals, apparently. Starved lions, starved wolves, starved dogs. They'd throw good people to them. You remember Paul himself even said that he had to fight beasts at Ephesus. That was really a bad place. And here were the believers there. And Paul says, you got to be different. Don't get sucked into this immorality. Don't get sucked into this old pagan lifestyle. Peter said the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3. Great word, he says, for the time past of our life may suffice us. In other words, look, the past life is enough of that stuff. That's sufficient. We wrought the will of the pagans, the ethne. We walked in lasciviousness, in lust, excess of wine, wild parties, carousing, abominable idolatries. And he says, we did that, but the time past of our life should suffice for that stuff. That's over. That's over. On the basis of all of this and of what we are in Christ, of all that God has purposed and all that God has designed and all that God has desired of the believer and the body, we are to be unique. We are to be different, not like the rest of the world. John said this in 1 John 2:15, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. For the world passeth away and the lust of it. It's a fading thing. It's going to self-destruct. We have no part with that. Society is hostile to godliness because it is dominated by carnal ambition. It is dominated by pride. It is dominated by selfishness. It is dominated by greed and lust and desire for evil. Its opinions are wrong. Its aims are selfish. Its pleasures are sinful. Its influence is destructive. Its politics are corrupt. Its honors are empty. Its smiles are phony, and its love is fickle. We have no part with that. We're different. We don't live that way. Not like society lives. And by the way, if you think this is just Paul talking, look at verse 17. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord. By the way, he says, I'm passing on this information from the Lord. I testify in